Alright, so I'm sitting here with regards to my next topic, and what I want to talk about today is bipolar disorder and how it can very easily be confused with depression and anxiety. So, when I was 18, I had a car accident, and when I turned 19, I was studying at sort of technical university, and I basically couldn't study. I couldn't understand. Well, I could understand, but I couldn't remember anything that I was reading. And eventually I had to drop out of university, and I got a job doing some arbitrary nonsense that was beneath me. But my point was that I had basically developed post-traumatic stress disorder, and through the help of medication, I don't think therapy helped me at all, but through the help of medication, I eventually got to the point where I was no longer what you would classify as post-traumatic stress disorder classifiable, but I had basically slipped into what I much later would define as having bipolar disorder 2. Thank goodness I don't have bipolar disorder 1, because that's terrible. And the medication they use for bipolar 1 is really bad. But luckily I managed to fall into the bipolar 2 category. Now, what I found interesting was that I was depressed and having also very high levels of anxiety, but the medication I was using, the typical sort of antidepressants and anti-anxiolytic drugs that you would use on on depression, wasn't really working, or they would work for 2, maybe 3 years if I was lucky, and then they would stop working. And then I would have to find a new antidepressant. Now, the antidepressants that did actually work for me for 2, maybe 3 years were SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So I tried and played with some of the new fandangled modern antidepressants, and most of them they didn't work for me. They didn't make me feel good. They just didn't make me feel good. They made me feel weird. And so, what happened eventually was I ran out of SSRIs. So I went to the doctor, a doctor that my friend recommended to me that was pretty good at diagnostics. And she spent an hour with me, and she basically came to the conclusion, according to her, that I had, she ran me through a whole bunch of tests, the whole usual Myers-Briggs type inventory stuff, the Rorschach ink blot tests, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And her conclusion was that I had bipolar 2. I wasn't depressed. I had been misdiagnosed. Now, what age was I then? I'm now 48. I was basically, I think, 41, when she told me that she reckoned I'd been diagnosed. And I had been diagnosed with depression and anxiety when I was basically 19. So that basically means that for 22 years of my life, I'd been misdiagnosed as depression, whereas I should have been diagnosed as having bipolar 2. Needless to say, the doctor put me on meds, the bipolar 2 type meds, and she told me, if this stuff works, you have bipolar 2. If this stuff doesn't work, you don't have bipolar 2. And that's like one of the number one ways to diagnose the illness. Started taking the drugs. It was 2 or 3 months. I started feeling very different. Very, very different. Way more intelligent. Intelligence is intelligence is intelligence. You can't really mess with that much. But I must admit that I felt like I was way more intelligent on the bipolar drugs, and the intelligence was just growing and growing and growing. Eventually came to a point where I could do my work 65% faster than I'd always been doing it. I didn't know, but I had like some sort of OCD, which was totally unbeknown to me. I was blind to it, where I was like triple checking everything I did at work, triple checking everything that I did at home. But it was mostly a problem at work, triple checking everything. Now that can make you really good at certain types of jobs, but at my kind of job, it wasn't helping. It was just basically making everything longer and slower, and creating a massive amount of backlog and a massive amount of work that I had to do at home. I felt like I had been a caveman for 22 years of my life, that I'd been functioning on about 25-30% of my capacity. And the medication that I was on now for bipolar 2 was literally just causing some sort of a renaissance, some sort of a blooming, some sort of a awakening. Yeah, that would be the word, awakening. It probably took me a year and a half before the full effects of being on the right kind of medication was realized. It was a gradual coming out of depression, being a caveman, being a Neanderthal, being very anxious, being, slow at everything, basically being a primitive caveman is how I would best describe how I was in comparison to how I am now. Being on the right medication is the next level, is life-changing. And to be diagnosed correctly is absolutely hyper important when you're dealing with things like depression, anxiety, etc. Mental illness needs to be diagnosed correctly, so that you can get the help that you need, so you can get the right drugs that you need. Otherwise, if you put on the wrong drugs, you're not going to feel good, you're not going to feel great, and you're not going to function like you're supposed to as a human being. Now, it took me about a year and a half to crawl out of my hole that I was in. But the effect was, I would say, almost immediate. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, one of the best sort of indicators of a good drug would be that it almost starts working immediately. You can almost feel the effects immediately. You can feel that things are changing for you almost immediately. I'm talking a day or two, maybe 3 days, and then you're starting to feel the effects of like, wow, something's different, something's changing, something's good, something's happening here. Now, why I'm telling you this is that I want you to know that being diagnosed correctly is super important. Because if you're not diagnosed correctly, you could spend 22 years of your life being a caveman, basically having 30% of your intelligence that is usable, that you basically could be jumping from one drug to the next and not getting any form of real help. You want to be diagnosed correctly, because if you're not diagnosed correctly, they're not going to have you on the right drugs, which means that you're going to be suboptimally drugged. Sounds terrible, hey? Sounds really terrible. But guys, God has given us brains to develop medications. God has given us brains to develop these kinds of treatments. God has given us brains to spot these illnesses, to see these weaknesses within our psyche, within our biology, within our brain, chemistry, etc., etc., etc. And we need to make sure that what is wrong with us is actually what we have recognized to be wrong with us. And we need to be treating what is wrong with us correctly. Now, I developed what I got my PTSD from a car accident. The PTSD eventually developed into bipolar disorder 2, but I'd been diagnosed with depression, with anxiety. And they'd been treating me with depression, with anxiety. It was working, but not working. As I said, I was functioning at 30% capacity of what I should be functioning at. If you have mental illness and you're not sure you're being diagnosed correctly, then get a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth opinion. Because it took me 22 years to get the right diagnosis. It took me 22 years to get to the right medication. Now I am a highly functional adult. I am a highly functional person. I'm highly functional on all levels. Why? Because I've been correctly diagnosed and I'm on the right medication. I cannot stress how important it is to make sure that you've been correctly diagnosed and that you're on the right meds, because you could spend a lifetime on the wrong meds and it can get you nowhere. 2 decades of my life is a long time to sacrifice. 2 decades of my life is a long time to be a caveman. 2 decades of my life is a long time to be a Neanderthal. And those 2 decades of being incorrectly medicated, those 2 decades of being on the wrong medication, probably cost me my first marriage. It probably cost me my first marriage because I was just not what I was supposed to be as a man, as a husband, as a person, as a father, as anything. And by the time I got to the right medication, to the right treatment, to the right diagnosis, it was too late to save my marriage. So, I've spoken about how ignoring the tools that we have today and, basically just thinking that your problem is going to go away or you're going to pray it away or whatever the case may be is foolish. Prayer has its place, I promise you. And I'm like I've said in previous videos, 90% of the time, 90% plus of the time, God is going to use what He's already created, what's already available, the people around you, and the options and the treatments and the tools around you that have been developed. He's going to use that to help you. You need to make sure that you are using the right tools, that you are using the right things, and that you're exploiting all options at your disposal to deal with the challenges that you have at the time. Ignoring the tools, the people, the doctors, the options, the medications, the whatever around you is foolish. It's going to cost you deeply. It's going to cost you potentially relationships. It's going to cost you your health. It's going to cost you your mind. It's going to potentially cost you your career. Make sure that you're correctly diagnosed. Make sure that you're on the right meds if you need to be on meds at all. If you don't need to be on meds, well, make sure you got the right therapist. Make sure you got the right pastor. Make sure you got the right friends. Make sure you got the right whatever it is. But don't just rely on this is what I've been told and this is what I should believe. You might end up wasting 2 decades of your life. You might end up wasting more than 2 decades of your life. You might end up destroying your marriage, your relationships with your children, your future, your career. It could be a whole host of things that you could be throwing away because you refuse to go and do your homework and go and make sure that you have gotten 2, 3, 4, 5 opinions from professionals, 2, 3, 4, 5 different types of doctors that you've consulted, and then you correlate what they tell you. It's super important to find a good doctor. It's super important to find a good therapist. It's super important to make sure that you are exploiting all the resources at your disposal. We have these things at our disposal these days. I mean, 100 years ago, we basically had cold water and rubber rooms and electrotherapy and torture, and that was pretty much it. Now things have changed radically for us. I mean, 20 years ago, the amount of drugs that were available for depression was minuscule. Now we have a whole host of drugs. I mean, I don't know how many drugs there are available for depression, but there's way more than 2 or 3. And my previous wife, my first wife's mother, basically ended up, committing suicide because there was only one drug at the time available for depression, and that drug didn't work. Now we have myriads of drugs, and if she had basically lived a little 10 years later, she would have probably been perfectly fine, lived a normal life, happy, well functioning, etc. My point is that mental illness is alive and well. It's here to stay. It's everywhere, and it is not easily diagnosable. It's not easily solvable. It's not something that's a quick fix. It's something that takes time. It's something that takes discernment. It's something that takes patience. It's something that takes finding the right kind of doctors, good doctors, right therapists. And it's going to take the right kind of people around you as well, the right family, the right friends to support you in this thing. Because, I've met so many families, so many friends that have family, and they don't even acknowledge that mental illness exists, We can't be crazy. We're not crazy. We're not mad. We don't need to go to a doctor or a therapist or a psychiatrist or a psychologist because we're not crazy. Well, to me, that's the most crazy thinking possible, that you can think that you might not need help when you actually do. I've met so many people, so many families, so many friends, so many colleagues that literally, they're at that point of, I'm not crazy. I can't be crazy. My family can't know that I'm crazy. There is no such thing as crazy. Therefore, I am not even going to go and get help. I'm just going to plod on with my little life as it is and suffer. Really? One thing I can say about South Africa, and one thing I'm grateful for South Africa, is the acknowledgement and the way that mental illness gets dealt with in South Africa. Because you've got other countries out there that are supposedly way more superior and way more developed and way more whatever the case may be than South Africa. And there, you're not even allowed to talk about mental illness. You're not even allowed to acknowledge mental illness. You're not even allowed to admit that it exists. And what happens? People suffer, people die, and that's really tragic. Really, this is with us, guys. We live in an abnormal world. We live in a fallen world. We live in an abnormal society. We live in an abnormal situation. Things are not how they are meant to be.